Hi everyone, my name is Lang Montgomery. I'm a diversity and inclusion specialist, and I want to talk to you today about allyship and being an ally. Now, we hear it a lot, but sometimes I think we don't always know what it is or what we're meant to do in that situation. Now, just for understanding, allyship or being an ally means that you will support someone that you don't necessarily share an affinity with. So, for example, you could be a man and you're making sure that you support women. You could be someone that is not LGBT and you are supporting people from the LGBT community, or you can be white and you're supporting people of color. By doing that, it shows that you're just showing a better level of empathy, understanding, and you are actually moving and taking active steps to make sure that you amplify voices of other people. But obviously, to be an ally, it's not always the most easiest journey straight away. One of my first things that I would really advise people is that you get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because sometimes we don't have all the answers. And also, as an ally, just a little top tip here as well, you don't have to have all the answers either. It's like, it's about how we support and connect with other people. But a lot of that relates to something called the comfort zone. Now, when we're in our comfort zone, we feel safe, we feel secure. Normally, we have a lot of people that we know, they have our back, we have their back. Well, actually, when you have someone else's back or they've got yours, you're being an ally. That's also what that's about too. But obviously, if you're not sure about maybe someone's lived experience or about a subject or what's happening in the wider world, that can put us into a bit of a fear zone. And with the fear zone, sometimes that can actually block us from being more inclusive and connecting with other people. Because, for example, sometimes if we're scared, we can be a little bit like, well, I don't want to get it wrong, or I'm not sure what I do. So that holds us back. But also sometimes when people are a bit scared, that means that they shut things down. They don't want to hear about things. They're not going to want to take on new information. And the thing is, that's perfectly normal, because actually all the time right now, we are constantly bombarded with lots of conflicting information. So it's quite hard for us to actually process that. But what I want us to do in this process, and this is where taking steps to be an ally takes you on this brilliant journey, which is actually supported by something known as the growth mindset, is that it puts us into what's known as the learning zone, but then we're in the growth zone. And when we're in there, it means that things feel okay, things feel safe. And actually, in the same way that we say it's okay not to be okay, it's okay not to get it right first time. It's actually good to actually learn and discover new things about life and about people. Now, obviously, I work in diversity and inclusion, and there are two questions that I'm constantly asked. One of them is, can I say that? Followed by, what can I do? Now, under can I say it, I'm going to talk about, which is here on the slide. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something called intersectionality. Now, intersectionality was developed by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s. She's a really great sociologist, and she came up with the idea that basically it was initially about systemic oppression, but actually how I use it in the context of diversity and inclusion is that it talks about the different identities we have. So, for example, what intersections make us who we are. So in effect, where did we go to school? What's our sexual orientation? What's our ability? What's our ethnic basis? What's our gender identity, our language, our culture? All of these things make us who we are. And obviously, depending on where we are, where we came from, that does impact sometimes initially some of the privileges that we have in place. But actually, privilege is an important thing for us to touch on right now, because actually that sometimes is why sometimes we have not been impacted, or or sometimes some of us are not part of a marginalized community, whereas other people are, because sadly there is discrimination in the world, which brings me back to my next point, which is why we have to be allies, or why we should be taking steps to be allies, particularly if we hold privileges. Because the fact is, if we do have privilege and we're born with privilege, we can't change that. But what we can change is using our privilege for good. Now, there's a bit of a continuum, there's a bit of a journey that I think we all go on. So where I talked about the growth mindset earlier on, also talking about our comfort zones, I think there's a bit of a stage that we all go through as allies. So we move from being apathetic a little bit. So sometimes, and we've all been there, sometimes we just don't know. And actually we don't always know everything. So sometimes how are we going to understand or know what's impacting or affecting someone if we're not sure about it? Because in a lot of cases, and being a human being means that unless we've experienced it directly or we've seen it ourselves, we don't necessarily know it's there. And that's why, again, we need to listen. So the next stage from being apathetic is to be aware. So sometimes we can know that there's stuff that isn't quite right. We think, well, oh, that's not very fair that that happens to those people. Or we can even be a bit surprised. Sometimes we're shocked to hear that people still get, called homophobic words, for example. We're shocked to know that racist language is still used a lot of the time. I know people are genuinely shocked at that, but it's happening. But then from being aware, you can then move to active, so that it moves you into a place where you can be well informed, you're sharing and seeking diversity when asked or prompted. And also you might have a bit of knowledge yourself, or you might actually just say, no, that's not right. And your voice gets louder with that moment. But then the final stage is kind of moving to being what's known as an advocate. So that means that you're really, really committed, you're routinely and proactively championing inclusion. And the thing is, that can happen very quickly with a lot of people, because all it takes is something that really sparks some interest in you, and it lights a fire underneath you, and then you're there, you're having those conversations, you're getting involved. Now, I've got some tips for being an ally too, because obviously the other thing with being an ally is we still have to be mindful, because I think the most important thing is we have to give space to people too. It's not just about us being like, hey, I'm an ally, so I'm going to tell you all about why I'm an ally. It's like, that isn't the way to do it. I mean, it's really great passion, but please keep that passion, but channel it in the right way, because that would be really, really well received by absolutely everyone. So my first thing is to avoid assumptions, and really actively listen. Now, it sounds really maybe a bit basic and a bit obvious, but it's really important that if someone, particularly if it's someone that you are claiming to be an ally for, or that you want to be an ally to, is telling you about their lived experience, really, really listen to what they're saying about that. And also try not to, never ever sort of gaslight people or tell them that, oh, well, maybe you should be more resilient, or, well, I'm sure it will get better soon, or things like that. Just let them talk about what the experience is, because sometimes that's all people need. They don't need you to have the answers. You don't have to fix anything. Sometimes all you have to do is listen. And also, I said at the beginning of this, but get comfortable with being uncomfortable. There are certain things that you may hear or see sometimes that maybe you've realized that you might have done that yourself at some point in your life. You're not on trial here. And it's also about a case of where just understand that if people are talking about their trauma or lived experience, it might also be different. You also might be a member of a similar community, and actually, because of different privileges, they've had a completely different experience to you. And that's fine, because remember, we are all individuals. When we looked at the intersectionality chart earlier on, obviously you see that we are many things. That is what we are. And I think the biggest thing that we need to celebrate is actually being part of different communities, but also being ourselves and being our true selves. And with that, that's the individual that we are. Another thing that I think I would really recommend is try not to be led by any stereotypes, but listen to people more and get a more direct and accurate view of what's happening. So, for example, and the media has a part to play in this, I hate to say. So it's not, I don't want to say the word fake news, but the media isn't always accurate. So my advice sometimes is to sort of consider the source and author of certain material, because again, that sometimes there are things that have been written about certain communities of people that actually have had maybe used certain stereotypes that maybe I don't think is truly representative of their lived experience. But sometimes my top tip to combat that is actually, if you do want to understand more about people from a certain community, try and look for resources such as blogs, podcasts, articles, books, even stuff that you see visually that is from people from those communities themselves, because I think that can give you a more authentic representation. And I also feel that that is a better sort of approach in terms of listening to other people's stories as well, hearing from people themselves, especially when sometimes there might be some people that are quite critical of a certain group or a certain type of person, which, okay, there are different opinions around and everyone's entitled to them. But I think in terms of, if you want to understand the true, authentic lived experience of someone, listen to people from those communities. And I think another good tip about being an ally is make sure that you speak up for people even when they're not in the room. So if you are going to be saying Black Lives Matters, for example, make sure that you're comfortable to be saying that, and that you are saying that really actively when there aren't any people of colour in the room, because, sort of performative allyship is something that actually isn't very well appreciated by people, and it's also not good. And also being an ally means sometimes, that's the other point about being uncomfortable, it means that you might have to face into a slightly uncomfortable conversation. It means that with the privilege base that you sit in that situation, means that you suddenly might not feel so comfortable in the room because you're expressing an unpopular opinion or what's deemed an unpopular opinion. But actually what you're doing when you're being an ally is that you are actually displaying that really, really great way of supporting a group of people. And sometimes doing the right thing means that sometimes everyone gets a little bit uncomfortable, but everyone knows deep down the elephant in the room is you are right and you are doing the right thing. And my final thing with being a top tip, being an ally, is keep showing up for people, because sometimes initially people might be a bit cynical, but actually, just keep being clear about how you want to learn, showing your learning, and actually just showing your support. So, attend events, watch TED Talks, look at, educate yourself, keep learning all the time, because I think that's one of your best ways of doing things. Two other final points on being an ally that I think are really, really important is we hear about things getting called out, but I want to talk about calling it out and calling it in. Now, calling it out, I think, is something that obviously when you are in more of an advocate space, obviously, not on your first day of being an ally, so to speak, because being an ally is an ongoing thing, by the way. There's not a sort of, 2-week training course on it or anything like that. Sort of the more confident you feel is, use your voice and privilege for good. So, but you don't have to do it in a super great, it doesn't mean you have to start going on a protest straight away over everything that happens. It's just the ways that you can call things out is just, make sure that, you say things like, perhaps that's not funny, or I think you're using stereotypes, or this isn't very inclusive. That's a good way of putting an initial boundary out there. And also that's a way of you making it quite clear that you're not going to tolerate that kind of conversation. Therefore, as a good ally, you are keeping the space safe. And that means it's being safe for everyone. I think the other thing that's really important in these situations is if ever you see someone that's ever been on the receiving end of any negative or unwanted behavior that is not okay, try not to be a bystander. So by that, just don't do nothing. So sometimes it's not safe to intervene, but the ways that you can do things is to check in with them afterwards. Make sure that person knows that you are supporting them, or just the simple "are you okay" can make a really big difference. Because if someone's just had a really awful experience happen to them, feeling that no one did anything or everyone just avoided them is just a really awful situation for someone to be in. And there's other ways that you can do things as well. So if you do see something going on, maybe record something on your phone if you're at distance, because that can help. And also offer to share a statement if there is a situation that requires that, because that could be at work or in wider society. But this is being an ally, and that's actually doing the right thing as well. But calling it in, which is my final thing, is, so obviously in the call out section, that's where we have to make more direct actions that are quite active, and you have to sort of, in some situations you'll get quite involved and it could be a bit more confrontative. But sometimes, again, I think one thing that we're missing and lacking sometimes is nuance. And we know that actually in a lot of situations that we have, sometimes people, they have good intentions, but they're just a little bit off. And so I think using a bit of emotional intelligence and also really looking at intentions, or sometimes if we're a bit unsure, I prefer to use something as a sort of middle step, which is something called calling it in. So let's say, I've had it before where I've been eating dinner and I've had someone make a statement like saying, "Oh, I don't know why we have gay prides anymore," and okay, it's like, not great. I'm LGBT myself, I don't really want to sit there hearing someone saying that when, they don't have any issues at all because they've been straight their whole life. But at the same time, I thought, okay, this isn't necessarily a call out moment, because I could actually see with the way that they were saying and doing it, it was actually meant without any offense. That was actually the intention, wasn't to cause offense. But again, that involves something that I call a nice middle step to calling it in. So obviously, it also, by calling things in, it provides people that opportunity to actually correct themselves, or provides that middle ground where they can actually think about perhaps what they've said. And then if they do continue to do that, then you might have to call it out. But sometimes it's important to just do it. So I just take, the way I call things in would be to say, look, I understand what you were trying to say. However, I find whatever it is offensive, and therefore try and say this, or actually provide some facts as well, because as an ally it's really important to actually provide facts to people as well. So this, so I would sort of say to that, example about the relative at the table, I would say, well, actually, yes, there's gay pride here and we have like equal marriage and this sort of stuff like that in the UK, but actually in 70 countries in the world being homosexual is illegal. and suddenly they're like, oh, I didn't realize that. So, you know, you just provide some wider context. And that's another thing as an ally as well. Try and make sure that you provide, if you have learned something, if you've had a great blog, podcast, or, you know, webinar, anything that you've seen that has really helped you with a situation, especially if it's understanding something towards a group of people that you're trying to offer more support to, ensure that maybe you share that with other people as well. Just because, again, it takes some of the emotional labor off people from certain communities if they're having to have the same conversation over and over again. That's also a good allyship move. But these are some of the top tips that I have about allyship. But obviously, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me, because I'm happy to pick up with you individually on that. Thank you.